A list of sensitive themes and topics covered in this episode can be found in the episode description. Welcome to This Guy Sucked, the show where we prove that it's never too late to have haters and you can't libel the dead. I'm your host, Dr. Claire Aubin, and I'm a historian, writer, and most importantly, certified hater. On this show, we talk about people from throughout history with legacies that need a little updating. Whether it's because of their politics, their behavior, or their impact on society and culture, these guys actually kind of sucked. And we bring in a new scholar every week to tell us why. With me today is the wonderful Dr. Robert Komaniecki, who is a lecturer in music theory and music history at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. He's got a PhD in music theory from Indiana University and a very funny, in my personal opinion, social media presence. You might know him from some very funny TikToks, some tweets, all kinds of stuff. Although now he's posts. What are we calling those? He posts more on Blue Sky.
I hope we're not calling them skeets.
Yeah, I don't like that one. He posts on Blue Sky. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here hating with you.
Thank you so much. It's I feel like we're at a kind of a good time in the world for hating, and there's a level of release that's happening with this. Like, hating on people is kind of a release valve. So
yeah, I mean, we just had a Super Bowl halftime show that was, predominantly taken up by really apex level hating. So
yeah, also on the previous episode, which will come out at the same time as this one, we talked about the Super Bowl there too. So it feels like there's kind of we're in a moment for this to be happening.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into what we're really all here for. And before we commence the hating, who are we talking about today? I've been really looking forward to this.
Well, today we're talking about Jerry Lee Lewis, and I fucking hate this guy. I teach a history of popular music course here at UBC, and whenever I get to Jerry Lee Lewis and the history of rock and roll unit, this wave of visible contempt washes over my face because I just can't stand this dude. But I'm looking forward to talking about him with you.
Just as a sort of like intro to some of this, I did a little bit of research going into this, which I always do, and this one I was like a movie character level of like, this guy sucked. Like, where everything I was reading, I was like, my God. So I'm excited to hear from someone who's more of an expert on this to tell me about more specifically why he sucked, because I was just like taken aback by all of the things I was coming across. But before we talk about the suckiness, we've got to sort of establish what the original, more popular narrative of Mr. Lee Lewis is.
Jerry Lee is how people refer
Jerry
to him
Lee is his
often.
first name. Yeah. So then Lewis is the last name. Okay. So we got to sort of establish why he's known in the first place. And in a lot of cases, I would say, as is the case for pretty much everyone who we talk about on the show, he's kind of venerated or held up as important historically in some way. So what kind of contributions to the world is he best known for?
So Jerry Lee Lewis is most well known as this real pioneer in early rock and roll. He has this nickname, the Killer, and he's known as this bad boy at the piano, an instrument that you don't often associate with bad boys. People talk about Jerry Lee Lewis like he's one of the architects of the genre of rock and roll. And, his legacy, people always talk about what a jerk Jerry Lee Lewis was. That part's not really a secret. And he has this idiom that he often would say. He would say, I'm the meanest son of a bitch to ever shit out a meat ass.
I'm glad swearing is allowed on this.
Yeah. And I don't know, like, somebody was like, oh, well, that's a weird saying. It's Southern. And I'm like, I've been to the South a lot. I've never heard anybody say that they're the meanest son of a bitch to ever shit out of a meat ass. But, he he had a mean, to put it mildly, he had a mean streak. But people always talk about him and venerate him as a pioneer of rock and roll. This is a guy who wrote or who recorded Great Balls of Fire and a whole lot of shaking going on. And so that's where he gets a lot of his flowers.
Yeah, I've never heard that expression. And
You never will again. If you Google it, it's just Jerry Lee Lewis talking about his meat ass. I don't know.
I mean, also, like, my partner is from Texas and says some real Southern stuff sometimes. Never heard that. Not from him, not his family, no one.
Next time you're with his family, just try dropping that into conversation and see what the reaction is. You can really gauge if it's an authentic Southern idiom or if it's just Jerry Lee Lewis.
I think they'd be having a serious conversation with my partner about breaking up with me if I said that at family dinner.
Get her and her meat ass out of here.
So in your research, what kind of role does he play in your work, your research, your teaching? Like, why do you think about him?
Well, when I teach music history, I'm trying to teach a couple things simultaneously. I'm trying to teach about the rapid advancements of technology that happened during the 20th century. I'm trying to teach about the actual trajectory of these creative decisions that lead to formations of new genres, these cultural factors that lead to new genres. But then I also try to teach about the historical narrative that goes along with that may or may not accurately represent how some of these genres were formed. And so that's where I find myself talking about Jerry Lee Lewis a lot, because in a lot of the literature about the birth of rock and roll, he's right there with Elvis, as like the two kings of rock and roll. And I think that narrative doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of who was coming up with this music in both of their cases.
Well, perfect. This sounds like a good segue, because I think the who was really coming up with these things is part of the conversation about why he sucks. Let's move to the sucking.
Absolutely.
Let's move to the sucking is not something I ever thought.
I think that goes on Dan Savage's podcast, not yours.
Okay. So, what part what's the first part, I should say, of Mr. Lewis's legacy that you think is being ignored or sort of downplayed? Why do you think he sucks?
Well, I think that we'll eventually get to his treatment of women and treatment of everybody, really. But when you talk about his musical legacy, Jerry Lee Lewis who's born poor. He lived in Faraday, Louisiana, and when he was like 3 years old, his brother was killed by a truck. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox thing, but they're like riffing on Jerry Lee Lewis's life story, having a tragedy early on. At one point, his father, who's this big, mean, snake-killing dude, that's true. He was known for just bringing rattlesnakes out of their attic and just killing them dead in front of Jerry Lee Lewis. So at one point, his father mortgages their house so he can buy Jerry Lee a piano. And that's the start. He starts really getting into playing piano around 7, 8 years old. And around 11 years old, that's where he starts hanging around all black piano clubs and listening to black performers do boogie woogie and things like this. This is, of course, in the segregated South, right? And when you read these writings about Jerry Lee Lewis and these obituaries, they all acknowledge that he was a huge dickhead, but they're all like, there's one thing that's undeniable: his originality and his, savant level talent at the piano. And I think you can only have that opinion of his piano playing if you aren't familiar with what especially like black artists in the South were doing around that time. That's part of the origin story of Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis as well, is that there's a lot of like black musicians around the South that are kind of paving the way. People like Amos Milburn, Cecil Grant, Ray Charles is around the same time as Jerry Lee Lewis, Fats Domino, same thing. But then, Jerry Lee Lewis is known for his flamboyant piano performances. He does all sorts of gimmicks and tricks. He gets a lot of credit for that being like an original shtick, but there were people like Slim Gaillard in the 30s doing kind of gimmicky, playing the piano with your feet, flipping your hands upside down and playing chords with the backs of your fingers instead. There are black musicians that were doing a lot of this stuff long before Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis started up.
And he's also kind of a contemporary of people like Little Richard, right? Who are like playing very flamboyantly, but get heavily criticized for that, and don't get this sort of like cool, like loud, yelling, fun white guy thing. Instead, get this like scary, ridiculous sort of reaction.
Little Richard is because Little Richard is one of those like those guys right there at the beginning of rock and roll. And his whole persona is so funny because, there's this period of time in Little Richard's career where he's very kind of light and effeminate. And, Little Richard was more or less gay. I don't know. He went back or forth. And at one point he said Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve. And he had all sorts of issues with loving men. But Little Richard, part of his persona, that lightness and that, kind of effeminate quality and the flamboyance, is because that's what allowed white audiences to feel comfortable around him. Like white men weren't as worried about Little Richard stealing their girl. And so yeah, that's sort of a different persona there. Jerry Lee Lewis had this real confrontational persona on stage, and a lot of men in his audiences. And if you watch the famous performances, there'll be all these guys crowding around the piano, shaking it. Everybody's sweating, their hair's flying everywhere, and as he's just kind of, ramping the performance up to a climax. And I think that's one thing he deserves credit for, is that he was he knew how to work a crowd and really work them into a frenzy.
Yeah, and I think you can definitely acknowledge that while also saying that he's not the first person to do this, and he is actually part of a tradition, and he's not the originator of the tradition either. Even like Whole Lot of Shaking Going On, which is like one of his most famous songs, is a cover of a song by Big Maybelle, who is a black woman. Right. So even one of his most popular songs is a cover of a black woman who's already doing sort of like rock and roll and blues and things like that. And so, or to some extent. And so I think there's something to be said for the fact that he is sort of touted as this person who is originating this stuff. But even the songs he's famous for are not all original.
Yeah, and Jerry Lee Lewis was a stylist, not a songwriter. A lot of his songs were written by black artists and covers of black artists. And even the term rock and roll comes out of, black Americans in the early 20th century. Rock and roll used to be a euphemism for sex. And Trixie Smith, had this song, what were the lyrics? I gotta check. My daddy rocks me with one steady roll. And, it was all about, like physical rocking around. And well, first of all, that kind of helps throw into relief some of the moral panic around rock and roll as a genre, when there's the whole genre's, nicknamed after having sex. But yeah, black women like Trixie Smith and Big Mama Thornton, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. These are like the originators of this genre.
There's also one of the things I came across when I was looking this up is that he got his start, or like part of what pushed him into doing this is that he would like play boogie woogie versions of church music or in church. And that was like this big scandal. So he realized, it seems fairly early on, that he could get attention by playing music scandalously, or playing music in a way that in some way pushed back against the sort of conventions of not just like the day necessarily, but the conventions of the context he was growing up in. So like the Deep South. So what he was in Louisiana, Texas, and Mississippi. Mm-hmm. Being a man who's playing boogie woogie piano in church is like a big deal.
Extremely scandalous. Yeah. If you're a white person, this kind of keyboard style that he was doing, this really rhythmic left hand, and then this really busy soloing right hand. That was par for the course keyboard playing in black churches around the time, but not so much in white churches yet.
Yeah, and then so from there he then he leaves wherever, Mississippi, goes to Nashville? No, he goes to Nashville later in his career.
Yeah, he bounces all around. He bounces everywhere. And we are he always ends up kind of circling back to Faraday, to Mississippi, the Deep South. That seems to be where he's most comfortable. That's where he found a lot of his his first loves. In the authorized biography, which is like the most sympathetic biography to Jerry Lee Lewis, he just casually is like, my cousin is the first girl who taught me how to really smooch. This isn't even the cousin, from later. This is just like, the first girl he learned how to really make out with was his cousin. So the Deep South. The first time he married, he was 14 or 15, married a 16-year-old girl. They separated within about 20 months. And he was, in his biography, Jerry Lee Lewis insinuates that he had to separate from her because she just wasn't wild enough for the killer, which is kind of a terrifying thing to think about for a 15, 16-year-old kid.
And on the subject of wives, he had 7 wives.
Yeah.
When I was looking this up, 7. And just for some background statistics on these wives, because I was so fascinated by them, and I'm sure that's going to be sort of the next big topic of conversation here. He had 7 wives, including 2 bigamous marriages. When he married his second wife, his first divorce was not final. And when he married his third wife, who we need to talk about a lot, his second divorce was not final. His fourth and fifth wives died while he was married to them. He, on the subject of smooching cousins, part of why his fifth marriage, I mean, it didn't dissolve, she died, but part of why it was already in the process of dissolving before she died, like right before she died, part of why that was happening is because he was obsessed with trying to get his fifth wife to have a threesome with her own sister.
That's right.
And then, listen to this, which is not bigamy, but still insane. His last 7th wife was previously married to the brother of his third wife. So he was married to someone who had been basically his nephew-in-law.
I didn't even know that one. I swear to God, trying to keep track of Jerry Lee Lewis's love life, it's like when Tolkien gets really going on like a family tree, and you're like, oh shit, I gotta lock in because there is so much lore here. I need a diagram. I didn't even know that about his 7th wife.
Yeah, you need to like go back to the front of the book to look at the list that say, and he begat him who begat.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and those, again, this isn't even the craziest part about any of his marriages. These are just some factoids about what was going on there.
Oh, yeah.
Hey everybody, it's Claire. If you, like me, think good, well-researched public history that is in a format other than angry middle-aged man yells at you about ancient Rome is important, consider joining our Patreon. It's only 1 tier, and for what works out to be less than $1.75 a week, you'll get access to all of our episodes instead of just the bi-weekly free episodes, and they'll all be ad-free for you. You'll also get exclusive access to what will become the full episode archive, bonus content, and lots of other fun Patreon exclusives to sweeten the deal. All of the Patreon money goes directly to me and my producer and editor, so that we can keep making this for you. Either way, thank you for listening. We're so happy to have you here. So let's talk about his third wife, which began in 1957. When he was 21, he married his 13-year-old first cousin, Myra Gale Brown. Yes. What are your thoughts on this?
And let the record show, first cousin once removed. So his first cousin's daughter, who he met the old-fashioned way while she was around babysitting his existing kid. Yeah, so Myra Gale Brown, his child bride. I mean, there's a lot to say about this. Fortunately, eventually Myra ended up doing okay. Like, she ended up in a really long, good marriage. But yeah, everybody in the biographies that I've seen and the interviews I've seen kind of makes excuses for Jerry Lee Lewis on marrying his 13-year-old first cousin. They say that, her parents left her around with just her pajamas on, and what's the guy supposed to do to resist? And Jerry Lee Lewis was super unapologetic for it his whole life. He said that, she looked like a woman. She was, I have the quote here. She was, fully ripe, ready for the picking, ripe for the plucking.
Yeah, blossomed out and ready for plucking.
Yeah, and so you hear this and you think, okay, maybe she looks like an old 13. And then you look up pictures and you're like, oh no, that's just a child. That's a full on child.
Yeah, and I mean the this quote where he says she looked like a grown woman. This was 55 years later that he said this, like to in an authorized biography. So he didn't ever feel weird or bad about it. It's not just like at the time he was trying to justify it. He later, despite enormous scandal, still didn't feel even a little bit bad about any of this stuff. Which is
No.
wild.
There's a lot that Jerry Lee Lewis probably should have felt bad about that he didn't feel bad about. And yeah, a lot of people try to excuse it as saying like it was normal for the time and the place. It was not normal to marry a child, 13-year-old cousin at the time. It might not have been unheard of, but it was still out there for sure. And yeah, you look at interviews with them, and because he would like bring her out to interviews, he was very defiant. And yeah, that's a kid, that's a teenager for sure. He surprised her with a marriage certificate. He picked her up from school. You know, she was 13 going to school. I think they met when she was 11. And yeah, picked her up from school. Hey, how was school? Anyways, here's a marriage license. We're gonna get married. And one of the things that really fucking disgusts me about Jerry Lee Lewis is there's this interview that he gives about Myra where he's kind of making light of the fact that she wasn't a virgin when they got married. He's like, only I could marry a 13-year-old and she wouldn't be a virgin. But she wasn't a virgin because she got raped by their next door neighbor. Like, and he's talking about it like, oh, just my luck, found a 13-year-old, but not even a virgin. Like this dude is like that is some evil shit. And yeah, I mean, so he married Myra, and then this is right as his career's kind of taken off, and he goes over on this big tour to England, and they're really excited to see these bad boy rock and rollers from America in England, and he brings her with, and reporters start asking like, "Hey, who's that kid with you?" He says, "Oh, she's my cousin." True. And they say, "How old is she?" She's about 15. That's like the lie that he decided to go with because he thought that they'd be like a little bit more chill about it if she was almost 16 was the rationale there. So he lied about how old she was, and he kind of obscured the fact that they were married for a minute. But then quickly, people found out, and it blew up in his face, and it really kind of nuked his career for like a decade. Because one of the first big purveyors of rock and roll over across the pond ended up being married to his child cousin.
Yeah, one of the things I also saw was that he also claimed that he married her because it made it more socially okay that they'd already been messing around is what the phrase he used, that they'd already been messing around, so he had to marry her to make it okay. The issue was not, and when I say messing around, obviously we're talking about statutory rape and just rape in general. This is an adult man and a child.
Yeah.
When he says this, like what he's saying is it's the marriage that makes it okay. It's not that there's any sort of like moral issue or ethical issue around any of this. It's that it was bad, not that he was messing around with his child cousin, but that he was messing around with his unmarried child cousin. And again, he is also married while this is happening.
Yes.
So it's not like he's single and doing this. He's married. So there are like so many other levels of just like, ugh, to all of this. Like just like disgusting, like horrible levels to this.
Yeah, he had a strange idea about what marriage was, I think, because his second wife too, it was like he was messing around with her and then her family found out, and so he's like, oh shit, better get married really quick, like that makes it okay. And that's part of the reason why he ended up getting married while still got married bigamously. So yeah, he had a religious upbringing. He was a very God-fearing man, and he would kind of like abruptly erupt into sermons sometimes backstage and tell people whether or not they were going to hell. And so yeah, I think he had some kind of religious hang-ups around marriage, but maybe he should have had a few more religious hang-ups.
Well, yeah. What do you think about what all of this says about sort of permissibility around really like not just like kind of questionable behavior, like what we would consider to be really, really poor behavior for people who are celebrities, particularly in like the music industry, although this happens all over the place. But we see this now constantly, and it's been the case for a long time. What do you think about this level of permissibility that sort of permeates all of this?
Yeah, so I can give my perspective on it being a music professor. You see this a lot, and it's always with guys. It's not really with women. But there will be some guy who's like a monster, and he's abusive to people around him. He's predatory, and people will be like, yeah, this is all true, but he has this undeniable, precious talent. That like that kind of is just bringing him over the finish line. Like he may have had some troubles like marrying and then physically abusing and impregnating his 13-year-old cousin, but he had this god-given amazing talent. So I hear it all the time with music people in the classical music world. It happens all the time. There'll be some guy that is turns out to be awful, but people are like, oh my God, he was so good when he conducted Beethoven's Seventh or whatever. And I've just never, I don't know, like the talent never really seems like it's that amazing that you should just be like, forgetting about all of the abuse. And I mean, it was just constant throughout his life. Like everybody that interacted with Jerry Lee Lewis has some sort of story about even, like a really brief interaction with somebody at a rock club. Jerry Lee Lewis informed him that he sucked and his band sucked and he was in the wrong business. Or, he would be backstage and he would do this thing where he'd like pretend like he was going to hit people and then pull away at the last second and like, just like a huge pain in the ass.
Like serious sort of teenage boy shit, like the stuff that like a teenage boy that really annoys you does, where you're like, why are you like this? And
Yeah.
it's bad enough that the New York Magazine slash like Vulture, I think, obituary of him is literally titled Jerry Lee Lewis was an SOB to the end.
Yes.
Like it's bad enough that his obituary is like, I don't know about this guy, basically. Like it's so rare that we have celebrities that are like bad enough that even though they make all these contributions and do all this, do whatever important stuff, become, for him, one of the members of the first induction class for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, all of this stuff. And we still are like, even when he dies, I don't know about that guy. Like,
Yeah, I mean, almost everybody he worked with thought he was a huge asshole. I mean, countless stories. There was one story where he was playing at a club and he didn't like the piano that they gave him. Piano is one of those instruments that it's, if you're a touring musician, you just got to kind of deal with whatever you're given because they're huge and hard to move around. He didn't like the piano he was given, so he just pushed the piano out of the club and because they have wheels, right? And was playing it as he was pushing it down the street. And then he just pushed it off this dock into the ocean. Like he got into a fight with Chuck Berry, called Chuck Berry the N-word. He slapped Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin was like, everybody was partying and carrying on, and Janis Joplin was drunk like everybody else. And Jerry Lee Lewis was apparently so freaked out that there was a woman drunk that he said, if you want to act like a man, I'll treat you like one. And he slapped her across the face. When you recorded albums with him, he was a dick to all of the sound engineers. He would just kind of play whatever he had in mind. He would not show up because he was too loaded to show up at the studio. He, in hotels, if he was having fun and didn't want to, leave a conversation, he would just turn around and take a leak on the wall of the hotel instead of use the bathroom. Like, this is like Neanderthal. Yeah. So it was a huge pain in the ass.
I also saw that part of this killer nickname is like maybe true. Like he tried to strangle a teacher when he was younger. He shot his bassist in the chest. Those wives that I mentioned that died, the fourth and fifth wives, one of them drowned and the other one I think had some illness. But like there are allegations that, especially the drowning one, that she didn't really drown or that he had some role to play in it, or maybe it's the other one.
It's the other one. I can help with this.
Please.
So yeah, it turns out the killer nickname might be more apt than than we first thought. But so yeah, the fourth wife, she died in she drowned in this friend's swimming pool, and she was on drugs when she drowned, and Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't around, and so the main suspicious thing though was that this conveniently happened a few days before her divorce settlement was supposed to come through. And so that kind of raised some eyebrows. The fifth wife, though, my God, I mean, so they were only married for I think 70 something days before she died. And, she was young. There was the kind of a setup thing. And right away, it was a rocky relationship. People that were around them describe Jerry Lee Lewis, smacking her and dragging her down the hallway and getting angry because she didn't want to have group sex, right? And at one point, she was really fed up with him, and she said, I'm going to leave you if you keep acting like this. And what Jerry Lee Lewis is alleged to have said is you're my wife, I'll kill you before you leave me. And then a few days later, she died. The way that she died, there was a 911 call. Miss Lewis is unconscious in the room. The police come out there. They notice that she has some bruises on her. She may or may not have had contusions around her neck. She has blood on her robe. And Jerry Lee Lewis comes out. He's got blood on him. A few days earlier, he had threatened to kill her if she ever tried to leave. And then, rumor was that she was trying to figure out a way to leave him. It's not looking good, right? It looks like he might have killed her. And Rolling Stone put out this big article essentially accusing or connecting the dots that, this should not have been dismissed as quickly as it was, because he did have to sit in front of a jury and they acquitted him of everything. But people in the know in that region said that there was, Jerry Lee Lewis knew enough people in the law and in the local government that there was just essentially no way that he would face any sort of consequence. He wouldn't be convicted. It would be like convicting Elvis in Graceland is what people said.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also like all of his wives said that he abused them.
Yeah, every single one.
Again, we're talking about like a Tudor king number of wives, like 7 wives, all were like,
Yeah.
and so it's pretty appalling that after this is happening too, like after all of this happens, that's when he gets inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, right? That's when, because he gets inducted in the 80s when it first becomes a thing, is the first class of people inducted.
Mm-hmm.
He gets the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not necessarily someone who says like we shouldn't listen to anyone's music if we don't like them. We shouldn't view their art. We shouldn't whatever. I think that's a totally personal choice. Should we be giving them Lifetime Achievement Awards? I would say no. I would say there's a way to engage with someone's art if you really believe in sort of fundamentally in the separation of the art from the artist, which again, a totally personal individual choice. If you believe you can do that, do we need to put them on a pedestal after it's very, very well known what their behavior looked like? I think no. I think that's a choice that we can collectively make as a society, and that's part of why it's important that we talk about this stuff.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you. And I've always had trouble doing the separate the art from the artist thing. There are some artists that I like whose sort of personal lives have soured me a bit on their music. Like I don't return to them as much. Like when I was a kid, I loved Kanye West's first couple albums, and now I'm just like, man, I can't go back to those. Like they just don't feel the same anymore. And so that being said, even if Jerry Lee Lewis was like the nicest dude in the world, I still don't think that personally I would have a ton of love for his music. It's never struck me as that kind of, this seismic shift that people describe it as in the 50s.
Yeah, I think there's also something to be said for the fact that despite all of this fame and all of that, he's still kind of remembered for like 2 songs mostly. Like he's remembered for a lot of other things too. But really, if you're like, what's he famous for? You'll say Great Balls of Fire and Whole Lot of Shaking going on,
Yeah.
which we've already established one of those is a cover.
Yeah.
Like, and those are, I think, absolutely wonderful songs, great music, really important, are important to the, sure. Sure, there's something, but they're important to the musical canon. However, the idea that they are such a seismic shift that they eclipse every other part of his personality, and his life that we've just established is like pretty worrisome, is itself also kind of worrisome. I mean, there's also, we haven't even talked about, like, he has some sort of like racial
Oh my
issues
God.
too.
This dude has so many racial hangups. It's insane. I mean, anybody with any sort of training in music and any ear on them at all would be able to tell you that he's being influenced by black blues players in the South. And I mean, like, that's just obvious. And yet, whenever he's interviewed, he only credits like white singers as his inspiration. And he's really firm about, I say this in present tense, even though he's passed away, but you know, like, he was always really firm about his piano playing being his own thing. And you know, if you go back and you look at some of these people like Cecil Grant and Fats Domino and Amos Milburn, that's just not true. Like, that's not, his piano playing is good, but it's not this like original spark. He did not create he did not breathe this life into rock and roll that I think a lot of people give him credit for.
Like, obviously that's just sort of inherently racist in and of itself, like this idea that you should be claiming credit for, I mean, even just objectively, if he's learning this from like hanging out in black boogie woogie and blues places, like, he knows that that's not where he got this from. Like, he knows this didn't just sort of like emerge organically from him, right? Like, that's part of this. And then he's also unwilling to credit them. He is like using the N-word on people pretty regularly also, like, not just Chuck Berry. There's a lot sort of to this.
I mean, his ego was just too big, I think, to allow, you know, and this is the thing that really pisses me off about Jerry Lee Lewis, is that he's always contradicting himself. You know, one minute he'll acknowledge where he got some of his musical influences from, the next minute he'll just trash it all and say it was all him. This massive ego, he notoriously like refused to do anything other than close out a show. Like, he wanted to be the last person on. And there's this anecdote of the time where they said that, you know, Chuck Berry was going to be the last performer on stage, and Jerry Lee Lewis was so pissed off that he closed the show by lighting his piano on fire and, you know, stomped off stage saying, you know, let's see you follow that. And, you know, various versions of the stories have racial epithets in there, but yeah, his ego was so big, and yet he was so unable to, you know, take responsibility for his own actions. After this whole thing with his cousin, you know, when shit hit the fan with that, and he was almost deported out of England. They were so freaked out. But when he came back to the US, he wrote this really mealy-mouthed, pathetic open letter to the music industry where he's just going on. I have it pulled up here. I have in recent weeks been the apparent center of a fantastic amount of publicity, and of which none has been good. But there must be a little good even in the worst people, and according to the press releases originating in London, I am the worst and not deserving of even one decent press release. And then he goes on, he's kind of like, oh, woe is me. Like, I've been getting all this bad press, your poor old buddy Jerry Lee Lewis. Nowhere does he mention the reason that he's getting this bad press.
Poor Jerry Lee can't even have one child bride, can't even marry one cousin.
Yeah.
Like, everyone else can, and then it's like, well, they can't. That's part of this. Everyone can't do that, and you especially can't do that, because everyone will know if you do that. And he also sets fire not only to piano, but a lot of this goodwill that he has, sort of, you know, because this happens in 1957 when he marries her, which is like right when his career is really taken off. He like can't, it seems like he can't help himself but do just horrible shit.
Yeah, he had an opening. You know, Elvis Presley was going off to be in the military. Little Richard had this big change of heart and was going over to religion momentarily. And this was going to be Jerry Lee Lewis's moment where he was going to assume his rightful place as the king of rock and roll. And he just completely blew it up. all from his own doing. And instead of taking any sort of responsibility for it, he just continued to hurt the people in his life, do lots of pills and booze, and just kind of, he had this resurgence later on where the country world welcomed him in. Not a good look for the country world, but yeah, he managed to kind of revive his career by doing some country music.
Well, I think the country music world is also a place where very often we can say they can't help themselves from doing horrible stuff too. To be fair, it is interesting though that that's where his redemption arc sort of in the, what is that, like late 60s, early 70s. He has this redemption arc that comes with the help of Nashville. Also, interestingly, I read in like an interview where someone said that they had introduced him to Bob Dylan and said, I think you should meet Bob Dylan. I think you guys could really do something. Bob Dylan says, yes, let's record together. Which, by the way, don't like that. I'm a big Dylan fan. Didn't like that. But he says, let's record together. And Jerry Lee Lewis says, no. It's like, absolutely not.
Masterful gambit, sir. Yeah, you have Bob Dylan offering you some records on a platter, and you're just like, nah.
Yeah, and this is also while he's like in his redemption arc, like or right before this. This is a moment where he could have like seen that and leapt on it and been like, great, this up and coming kid from Minnesota is gonna. Mm-hmm. But no, he says, absolutely not. You're not cool enough for me. Where's your child bride? Bye.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Get yourself a child bride before you talk to me. Kill a few rattlesnakes before you talk to me. His ego was so big. He couldn't handle the idea of being second best to anybody. And because of that, he had this really weird relationship with Elvis, who he viewed as like, actual competition. And at one point he got arrested because he showed up outside Elvis's house just totally wasted, waving a gun around, and told Elvis to come out. And waving a gun around seemed to be something that he did a fair amount of, because that's how his bass player ended up getting shot in the chest, allegedly, is that Jerry Lee Lewis was just playing with a gun and it went off and shot his player in the chest. Whether or not there's other aspects to that, we don't really know. We only have his word for it.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that there are so many moments here where it seems to be about this sort of like bravado and this larger than life persona and putting on a sort of performance and styling yourself a certain way and behaving a certain way that's normally for most people, or for a lot of artists, that's an attempt to sort of create a persona, right? And like create a public image that doesn't necessarily translate always to like who you are as a person, what your personality is, what your behavior at home is. But this guy, it's like all the same across the board, which is kind of like odd, I think, at least to a sort of outsider.
It is. Yeah, he's an odd guy. And when you watch interviews with Jerry Lee Lewis, there's like this palpable tension in the room. He's just got these beady eyes, and he's just looking for some reason to tee off on the interviewer. And he's just like this mean dude, and so people have to, people that work in his orbit have to do all of this kind of like emotional management to make sure that he doesn't fly off the handle and punch somebody in the face or get in a fight or start beating up one of his wives. And there's just, he was just this massive liability, and I don't know how people stuck around him as much as they did.
Yeah, I think there's obvious tension in the room when the guy you're talking to has a sort of reputation for shooting people in the chest.
Yeah, you might choose your words carefully if you're the interviewer there, and Jerry Lee Lewis is sitting across from you reeking of Crown Royal whiskey, and you're just like trying not to be the next bass player that gets shot in the chest.
Yeah, and sort of the much later part of his life, even his performances start to become like really off the rails, not in the sense of like off the rails like lighting things on fire and playing with his feet, but like playing really bizarre music. Like a thing I was reading was like he would play random Christmas songs during his performances. He would play for 4 hours nonstop. Like it's just, things get weirder and weirder as he gets older, because there's not that force of personality there to like for him to play off of anymore. And he just is like a weird, angry old man playing music that people are they're there to hear him play Great Balls of Fire. And then they get this dude who's playing Jingle Bells and sweating for 4 hours.
So much sweat. My God.
That is one thing that really stood out to me in looking at photos. He's so sweaty, and that's no problem with that. I get it. That's fine. But it is like kind of an interesting primary characteristic when you look at him.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of helps you imagine what it'd be like to be around him. You know, you see these beads of sweat rolling down his face. You see his aforementioned beady black eyes and his kind of reluctant, when he smiles, it doesn't really reach his eyes. There's just this kind of tension there. And yeah, I mean, he played whatever the hell he wanted to play. And the audiences just had to deal with it, or else he'd start, he'd get in a physical fight with them. He did at several points. He was playing in Germany, and people were like, play rock and roll. And he was like, you're all a bunch of Hitler youths or whatever. And just like went off the rails on him. He just did whatever he wanted.
Okay, also kind of a read on all the youth of Germany. But we don't need to give him any flowers for that. I'm just kidding. I think you have made a very convincing argument for why he sucks. And I also think you actually didn't need to convince me at all, because like I said, every single thing I looked at before recording this was like, oh my God, like I could not. And there's so much more. This is just 50 minutes of a lifetime of insanity, like a lifetime of just like harming women, truly, like from when he was like very young, like harming women and being a racist and lying about stuff and claiming credit for things. And it's just like he has this lifetime of that. So yeah, I think he sucked. I think we're there.
He certainly did suck. Yeah, usually after I'm done talking about Jerry Lee Lewis in my classes, it's just quiet. And it's like, the students are like, are you okay? You really don't like this dude. Like, no, I don't.
Next time you can just point them to this episode and say, listen to that and you'll get it.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was so wonderful to have you here for sort of solidarity and hating.
Absolutely.
Dr. Komaniecki can be found on Twitter at Komaniecki_R, on Blue Sky at Komaniecki.bsky.social, and on TikTok at Robert Komaniecki. Is that all of them? I
think so. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, we'll also link all of these things here for those of you who like, a random hidden C, a hidden I in the name. I get it. I have a lot of vowels in my one. Wonderful.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of This Guy Sucked, a member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. This episode was hosted by me, Dr. Claire Aubin, featuring special guest Dr. Robert Komaniecki, and produced and edited by Tom Umani. All of our theme music was written and produced by the amazing Marshall Dean Williams. If you'd like to support the show and get access to all episodes, including 2 extra episodes per month, you can subscribe at patreon.com/thisguysucked. See you next week.